Today I'm speaking with Francoise Bourzat. Francoise is very well regarded in the community of people who do research on psychedelics. And she has Western training in psychotherapy, but most relevantly, she's undergone a thorough apprenticeship in the Mazatec tradition in Mexico in its use of psilocybin mushrooms and salvia divinorum and other psychedelics. As you'll hear, she has a wealth of experience on other fronts with MDMA and ketamine and other compounds. And she's the author of the book Consciousness Medicine. She's also produced an online course that's available on her website, francoisebourzat.com. And my focus here isn't on the scientific study of psychedelics. Rather, it's on the experience itself and how one should personally approach the question of whether or not to seek out these experiences. Francoise and I discussed the importance of set and setting and dosage, the differences between various drugs, the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, how to integrate these experiences into one's life, and several other topics. All the obvious caveats apply, and I issue a few at the beginning of the conversation. To be clear, I'm not recommending that anyone take psychedelics. However, knowing that some of you are taking them, or will take them, I want to create a useful resource for you in the app. So this is just the beginning of my explorations on this topic, and there will be more resources to come. And now I bring you Francoise Bourzat. I am here with Francoise Bourzat. Francoise, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, how do you describe what you do? We will have a long and I expect deep conversation about psychedelics. But how is it that you come to have any knowledge at all about these compounds and how to work with them safely, intelligently, usefully? How do you summarize your background and your training in this area?
hmm I was exposed to this method using psychedelics shortly after coming to this country in 1981 from France. And I met some people who were counselors, and part of their approach was the usage of psychedelics such as MDMA, MDA, mushrooms, LSD, and ketamine in the process of ongoing psychotherapy as an adjunct, as a tool, a facilitating tool for self knowledge and healing. I was really interested in it. I had studied psychology in Europe before, and upon being exposed to this method and myself being a client of this method here in this country, I decided to study psychology, deepen my knowledge, my academic knowledge through graduate programs, and continued to study with this teacher who had been my guide and therapist, and pursued assisting him over a period of time. Then in 1998, I was fortunate enough to meet a woman in Mexico who was a carrier of the traditional usage of sacred mushrooms in her own tradition, in her own indigenous tradition. And for the last 20 years, now 22 years, I have been involved in this indigenous population called the Mazatecs in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, and being able to study and partake and participate and guide, co-facilitate ceremonies there for over 20 years now with the Mazatec as an apprentice and a colleague and a collaborator.
And I should say, we're not going to focus on your background going forward. So anyone who wants more information, there's a lot in your book, Consciousness Medicine, which is you have a very colorful story, and there was certainly high drama there in the beginning. So there's more about you and your approach to these things. Anything we don't cover in this conversation,
Mhm.
much of it can be found in your book. And I think I should issue a disclaimer of sorts to our listeners before we jump in, because obviously the following discussion does not constitute medical advice, and it isn't a recommendation that any specific listener take psychedelics. I mean, it should be obvious that Francoise and I don't know anything about you and your personal situation. And if you think we might, you've probably taken too many drugs already. So while our taking the time to discuss the benefits of certain drugs will naturally be interpreted as kind of advocacy for them, you should also notice that implicit in much of what we're going to say here is that we're discouraging their irresponsible use. And, unsafe use is obviously irresponsible, but I would also include in that merely recreational use. I mean, you might drink alcohol recreationally or smoke cannabis casually, but I certainly don't recommend that anyone take a full dose of a psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin just for fun. And Francoise, you and I will talk about whether you agree with me here, but I mean, if taken at all, I think these drugs should be taken with a serious therapeutic or spiritual purpose. And if you're bumped by my use of the word spiritual, you will understand what I mean by it by reading my book, Waking Up. So to be safe and responsible here is not merely to attend to general safety in ways that we'll describe. It's really also just to have a serious purpose and use these as tools of exploration and psychological growth. And as we'll say, many of these compounds seem to be physically well tolerated, but they might not be psychologically well tolerated or well tolerated by you. And just on the physical side, even in cases where there's no evidence of neurotoxicity for these drugs, and that's true for many of them. I mean, for some, the data don't exist, but for the principal ones, it does. I would say, and we'll say when we get to it, that MDMA might be in a class by itself as showing some possibility of neurotoxicity. But generally speaking, these drugs are very well tolerated and don't have a lethal dose that you're going to get anywhere near taking them in the normal amounts. However, they do have peripheral effects, like raising blood pressure, right? So there could be contraindications for certain people, and you have to think about those things in advance of taking any of the advice we're about to give, whether it's explicit or implied. And I should also say that most people listening to this discussion are living somewhere where these drugs are very likely illegal, right? So that's an additional concern, which is probably beyond the scope of this discussion. So, with all of that said, none of which was vetted by a lawyer, this is just my free association on the topic. I want to ask you, Francoise, who should take and who shouldn't take psychedelics? How do you approach that question?
That's a very important question. And I think it connects with the intention and, as you said, the set and setting. People who should not take these substances are people who don't have intention, who take them for, you know, recreationally or in combination with alcohol or party or dehydration or in an environment that's not really safe or supported, where they don't have any support emotionally or psychologically if something arises. I think also people who are, pregnant, people who are having blood pressure, heart condition, people who have fragile immune system, deficiency disease, people with HIV positive should be mindful, people with mental conditions such as psychotic episodes, schizophrenia, borderline personalities, bipolar disorder. These are conditions that are really can be problematic for the usage of psychedelics, or at least should be really, really highly contained by someone with medical knowledge, psychiatric skills. So, yeah, I think these are the main conditions that I think of as of now. Maybe some others will come along the
Hmm.
discussion, but yeah, this is what I think right now.
And how many trips would you say you have guided at this point?
Oh, I don't know, a few thousands,
And how many have you taken yourself?
over 100.
And what compounds do you have the most experience with? Yeah, I'll ask you about the specifics of each as we get deeper into this topic, but generally speaking, what do you consider yourself more and less an expert in?
I consider myself an expert in the work with sacred mushrooms, mostly.
So psilocybin and
Yes,
psilocin being the active
yes,
ingredient there. Yeah.
yes, yes.
What other compounds do you feel that you have taken enough and guided people enough to have strong opinions about?
MDMA, LSD, ketamine, 5-MeO-DMT. Yeah, some experience in Huachuma, the San Pedro cactus, mescaline containing. Mhm.
Mhm.
But this is not really my main field of expertise. Mhm.
What about Salvia divinorum?
Salvia divinorum. Thank you for mentioning. Yeah, I
Mhm.
have a lot of experience with Salvia divinorum. This is one of the sacred plants in the Mazatec tradition of Mexico, and I have the great fortune of being able to journey with that medicine frequently when I go there.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay, so we'll give people quite a tour here. But before we do, let's just keep it in the kind of general area of all these drugs, as different as they may be. How do you view the relationship between psychedelics and other methods of first person inquiry like meditation?
I find the usage of psychedelics having a great advantage in their capacity to lower our defense, to lower our inner conversation regarding the way we identify with the certain aspects of ourselves, with certain belief systems. And they allow us to touch a deeper, holistic, original blueprint of who we are. That being said, they also highlight the very belief system and the way they were constructed and set and the circumstances of their manufacturing. So we have the capacity with psychedelic to not only see the making of our predicament and our limitations and contractions, but we also have the capacity to connect with what is underneath those contractions, a sense of truer self, a sense of original, more liberated potential.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things jump out for me on this question. One is the point that Terence McKenna so often made, and with a mischievous grin, that the comparison between psychedelics and other methods is incredibly stark when you think about the guaranteed effect. For better or worse, if you give someone an effective dose of LSD or psilocybin or any other psychedelic, they are guaranteed to have a change in their experience. Whereas if you give them some instruction with respect to meditation or yoga or any other method, there's absolutely no guarantee that they're going to connect with it at all, and they may just come away bored or worse, convinced that there's really nothing there to discover, right?
Mhm,
Whereas with psychedelics, whatever your fate is with your first experience, boredom is simply not in the cards.
mhm,
And so that's one very stark difference. And so for people like myself, it might be true to say that, but for some initial experiences with psychedelics, I would have been very unlikely to have persisted with meditation long enough to have discovered just how profound a practice it is. I actually don't know what, because I came to it after having had a few experiences with MDMA and LSD, but
mhm.
barring having some real talent for it, my intellectual interests were not such that I was going to gravitate toward it, and I think
Yeah.
I could have easily been someone who tried it for 10 minutes and came away very skeptical that there was anything to discover by looking inside or by turning the mind upon itself.
Mhm,
And I guess the other distinction here is more categorical with respect to the experience one has in meditation and on these various compounds, because in meditation, the goal is really not so much that to provoke changes in the contents of consciousness, but to recognize how consciousness always already is. I mean, just even ordinary consciousness, and to recognize certain features of it that are always present, like the illusoriness of the ego that most people think they have in their heads. So you can cut through this illusion of having a self in your head very much in the context of ordinary sights and sounds and sensations, and the loss of self in that context need not precipitate any sweeping psychedelic changes in one's experience. It can in certain contexts, or certainly with a lot of concentration, it can on retreat, for instance. But
Hmm.
generally speaking, it's not so much about transforming the contents, whereas psychedelics, by their very nature, usher in enormous changes in the contents of consciousness, and for better and worse. I mean, we'll talk about the distinction between so-called good trips and so-called bad trips, but I wonder if you resonate with that distinction, because you can have the same kinds of insights that one has in meditation, and certainly if you have a background in meditation, it can stand you in good stead in the midst of a psychedelic experience. But it is a kind of figure ground difference where I guess meditation targets, pure being, most of the time. And you certainly can plunge into extraordinarily deep states of pure being under psychedelics, but there's so much to the landscape of mind that you're exposed to along the way that the very common experience is of having just radically expanded content of consciousness.
Hmm. I agree. I feel like the the specificity of psychedelics that I appreciate, not in comparison, but next to meditation practices or even ritual practices like sweat lodge, which is less meditative and more physical, right? More physical and of connection with nature. Very very powerful way of opening the psyche and the body and spirit. Psychedelics have the propensity of opening all these different channels all at once. Simultaneously, there is this physical, visceral circulation of energy. There is an emotional opening again, or enlarging of our capacity to feel and recognize emotions, an intellectual grasp of a cognitive intelligence of what makes us be who we are. And then there is the great spiritual expansion. And the fact that all these different transformative moments are aligned and simultaneously happening all at once is what creates the specificity of psychedelic healing, I think. Because we can do, trance dance and be very much in our bodies, but then we might not be really open to the emotionality that we feel towards another person, or we may be do a meditation retreat, and be separated from nature or from our past, depending on our, of course, the meditation we're doing. The psychedelics really, it's a kind of a platitude, but I'm going to say it like that. It opens all channels at once, and that what makes it so transformative. The visceral, intellectual, cognitive, and spiritual are all merging for the formation of a synergy that creates the transformation, and that creates
Mm,
the insight. See, there is not only a physical experience, there's an insight, and then there is a spiritual expansion. And I think that this different poles working together creates the branding on our psyche and our body and our spirit of this exploration and transformation and new
mm.
opening and new possibility.
And how do you view the difference between experiencing insights with respect to one's personal psychological content versus transpersonal insights?
Hmm.
Because many people who have had these experiences with one compound or another will have noted that there are, at a certain dose or at a certain stage of the journey, one is encountering the obvious reference points with respect to one's life,
Hmm.
and maybe, reconsidering one's place in the world and one's relationships. And, again, for better and worse, these can be extraordinarily pleasant and extraordinarily unpleasant
Hmm.
encounters with one's own mind. But then there are other places on this continuum of experience where you're pitched into highly impersonal, often called transpersonal,
Hmm.
content that has no reference point with one's personal life or even with one's humanness. There
Sure.
seem to be landscapes of mind that are beyond
Hmm.
anything that has a merely human biological motif about it. I mean, they can be, mathematical landscapes or just It's very hard to describe what category of thought they would fall into, but again, you can go so far as to have no memory that you have taken a drug or that your mind has ever been in any state other than the one you find yourself in. I mean, these can be experiences that seem eternal for as long as they last. How do you think about that continuum?
I feel that this continuum depends. Well, there's no really any way of predicting anything, but it has different factors that I've seen over the years playing a part. One factor is, of course, the intention again. Does someone wants to go into this exploration for the intention of clarifying, elucidating some blockage that are so crippling in real life that they need clarity. So then we're looking at the human condition, right? Looking at the basic of the human condition, which psychedelics can really bring a lot of clarity on. And then we have the intention of creating what we call rebooting the system and connecting back with source, replugging our, not even our psyche, our soul to the what we call the greater consciousness, the being, the place where we come from, or we can say for those of us who believe in that vast field of consciousness and unified field of consciousness. So it depends on the intention, and then it depends on the dosage. And then it depends on the work that the guide would provide for the experience. So there are different factors that can influence the depth and size and magnitude and topic of the experience itself. But you're right, the capacity of psychedelics to transport us into territory where we really are not who we are. Our name even doesn't mean anything. We are beyond our identity, our personal, our human form. And we are what the shamans used to call dismembered. We are brought into pieces and sort of unmade, unmade,
Mm,
unraveled, so our soul can be really liberated. I mean, this is really kind of the Tibetan Buddhism in a way, also being liberated from the human form to for the spirit to be freed from matter, and that experience is really very, very possible. And I'm not saying we can predict it will be experienced by people just on will, but this is accessible in psychedelics. And I think this is
mm,
really a lot of why people aim at experiencing psychedelics, to really reconnect with something fundamental in our being, in our existence, or maybe in our essence. The human, the psychology being part of our existence, and then part of our essence on the spirit level, on the non-human level, is what we aim to reconnect with on psychedelics, I believe.
What's the significance of memory here? And because it's often the case that much of the content of a psychedelic trip is not clearly recalled. I mean, one often has the experience of coming down, which is analogous to waking up from a dream, where you know that it was incredibly vivid a moment ago, but now you can only dimly capture a few shards of memory. What do you think is the significance of the experience if, let's say only 1% of it can be consciously recalled? Does that matter, do you think? Or is there benefit in simply having an experience
Hmm.
of a certain immensity that then really can't be adequately captured in
Hmm.
words afterwards?
Well, it is true that all of us want to catalog or gather or collect our wonderful or meaningful or transformative moments in an experience. May they be difficult, or may they be fabulous, or may they be ecstatic. We want to remember. It's like we have this human condition to want to know and to want to remember. However, I do believe that whatever the experience is during a journey, what we call a journey, with psychedelics, is meaningful, it's effective, and it doesn't really matter how much we remember of it, regardless of our propensity for wanting to grasp
Mm,
and grab and collect those memories. The important factor is, why did we want to go into this experience, and how are we doing on the other side? What is the transformation that has taken place below our awareness or below our memory that leaves us like a newborn that leaves us in a different form, in a different mindset, in a different heart set or spirit set. And that is part of the big piece of what I'm sure you and I will be talking about, of the integration phase of these experiences. Otherwise, yeah, one can have a meaningful journey that is not really harvested on the other side, and that's a shame. So I do
Mm.
believe that even though an experience may be 1% remembered, it still has a great effect. And I have many examples coming to my mind as we speak here of people who have had very strange experiences that from the outside looked very significant, either physically or the way they were moving or the way I was sensing what they were going through major ordeals. And then on the other side, they would remember very little of it, only to find out that their life was completely different afterwards. So the result is in the aftermath, right?
Okay, well, let's move through these stages systematically
Hmm.
and begin with what is often called set and setting.
Hmm.
I forget, it was probably Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass, who introduced these terms.
Hmm.
How do you think about set and setting?
I think about them as paramount to the experience. Set being the mindset, the intention, the purpose, the inquiry, what brings someone to an experience, what is the presenting issue, problem, stuckness, wish or prayer that is needing support. And so that's set. That's also set refers to not only the overall intention coming into an experience like this, but also where is the person at the day of the experience? I speak of that in my book about, is the person calm? Is the person prepared? Is the person resourced? Does the person has a support system? Does the person is in a fairly relaxed mood, or was the person having a major marital fight or professional drama the evening or the evening before or the morning of the journey? So that's a big situation that can really influence the outcome and the experience itself. So that's set. That's
Mhm.
about set. Setting is about the environment, the relationship with the guide, the location of the journey, the length of the journey, the way the actual experience unfolds, meaning how long is that going to be? How is that going to be guided? Is someone going to be singing? Is it going to be music? Is it going to be touch? Is it going to be outdoor, indoor, solitary, in a group? So all these are part of settings, the actual physical environment of the journey, as well as, like I said, the personal relationship with the guide, which creates a container, as we call that, as a therapeutic or at least shamanic or spiritual container for the experience to unfold. So those are the two,
Mhm.
how I define these two terminology.
And what if someone doesn't have a guide? Again, we're talking about a practice that is in almost every case illegal, right? I mean, obviously there are a few countries where you can do this legally, but most people hearing us talk about psychedelics, will have been taking them or be considering
Hmm.
whether to take them in a context where, they have procured them illegally and anyone who is guiding them is doing something illegal. So, what is a guide likely to mean in that kind of context?
Hmm. There's different definitions of guide depending on the magnitude of impact, influence, and intervention the guide gives and offers during an experience. In such contexts as at Burning Man, for example, which the use of drugs are illegal there. But as we know, there's a lot of people being introduced to psychedelics at Burning Man. I've heard that a lot.
Mm,
Then generally there's a group of people or some friends who are maybe more experienced that are able to look over or provide some safety or some support in case of difficulty. A guide can be just a friend, just someone in a house that is, helping in case there is distress, or can call emergencies if there is intense distress. There are countries in which psychedelics are decriminalized more and more in this country as well. I'm not I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I'm just naming the reality here. So there's more use of psychedelics, considering it might not be such a crime to personally ingest psychedelics. Actually, natural psychedelics, huh? We're talking about mushroom, ayahuasca, iboga, San Pedro, and of course
Mm.
cannabis now.
Peyote. Yeah.
Peyote and
Yeah.
San Pedro. And so, yeah, the decriminalized nature has offered a certain, I don't know if permission is the word, but a certain access, huh? A certain a lowering of the fear of the consequence for people to be ingesting some natural compounds. So that's a factor. And then some countries like the Czech Republic and Portugal have actually decriminalized other substances as well, like MDMA, LSD, and some hard drugs even that we don't use for journey, like just like cocaine, heroin, and such. But the decriminalizations has certainly opened up some territories for people to feel a little bit less scared about ingesting substances. And so, but the presence of a guide is still valid. It's a little bit like, designated driver, right? I mean, so
Right.
there's a group of kids or people, adults, who want to, go to a party, and one person is a designated driver and doesn't do anything to keep people safe on the way home or even at the party, possibly. So, the same practice works for psychedelics as well. Again, like I said, it all depends on the impact and work of the guy during the experience.
Right. Yeah. I think from my point of view, the minimum criterion here is that you want someone in your environment who has control of the environment,
Hmm.
who can respond to anything that happens
Hmm.
out there in the real world while you are tripping. I mean, we're talking about a psychedelic dose as opposed to a
Hmm.
microdose of any of these compounds. And, that person ideally would have some experience in the experience you're about to have. But, the absolute minimum criterion is to be in the company of someone who can wake you up if the house is on fire, right? So that means you're not alone. Now, I'm not going to tell experienced psychonauts that they can never trip alone. It's really not my place to say. If you're a mature person, that this is, I've done a fair amount of tripping back in the day alone as well. But in hindsight, it certainly wasn't always done responsibly. And, I would recommend that, control of the physical environment means that you not do this at a rock concert or some place where anything can happen and you really can't foresee what's going to happen. So the safety boxes need to be checked before you take a psychedelic dose of any of these drugs. How do you think about the difference between an internally directed journey, for instance, one that would be brought about by, remaining blindfolded throughout the trip, or at least through the peak of it, versus interacting with others and being out in nature and having one's senses directed toward the world.
It's a very different territory, obviously, if we are in a fairly lower dose of psychedelic and interact with the outside world, with nature, with the elements, with other people. This is a certain category of experience that can be extremely fruitful, extremely liberating, extremely explorative, and healing. Certainly, to be in nature on a lighter dose of mushrooms or LSD, or can be very a deep a deep opening into the receptivity we have towards others, or the our resonance with nature and our love for the elements and the life of nature as an organism. It's going to be extremely powerful. An introspection, either in the dark as they do in Mexico, or blindfolded if it's during the day and in an environment where the light is still on. Such an internal exploration blindfolded on a higher dose of psychedelics requires really, it's a different journey. It's a journey of the inner self, or of the subconscious, of the spirit realm, of the, as I said earlier, the intricacy of the inner makings of our existence as human beings in this very incarnation. So this is fundamental, looking at who we are on the fabric of our human existence, and that is a much deeper, broader, and of a different nature. I'm not saying one experience is more healing than the other. For some people who are constantly exploring their inner self but are unable to have connection with nature or other people, it might be more fruitful to have a light dose of mushrooms and be in nature looking at the world around them. It might actually
Mm.
be more complementing their healing palette, right, than another introspection inwards.
So how would you recommend that people assess their mental set? Because obviously most people, certainly many who understand what they're getting into here for a first trip or for really any trip thereafter may have some anxiety about it because this
Hmm.
is that you're really hurling yourself toward the abyss here at any significant dosage. And people have a sense of how challenging some of these states of consciousness can be. So it's natural to be anxious, or at least to be quite impressed by the undertaking that is
Hmm.
before you. How to differentiate that from being in a frame of mind that seems likely to produce a unpleasant
Hmm.
trip, in its entirety. And again, we'll talk about the good and the bad here in a minute, but
Hmm.
how do you know whether your set is what it should be, minimally to embark on a journey?
The first thing I would like to say is that it is very healthy and natural to have a degree of apprehensiveness before such ordeal. Going into a psychedelic experience of a big enough magnitude, right? The introspective internal journey is by definition going below the layer of our ego construction. And the ego doesn't like letting go. The ego doesn't like getting out of control. And basically, when we are taking psychedelic to that level, we are surrendering our ego despite its will. We are chemically altering the capacity of the ego to take a hold of our life and make decisions. So it's very natural to have this apprehensiveness or anxiety, we can call it. I call it apprehensiveness because anxiety starts to be a little pathological. But to be apprehensive of what's going to happen, the unknown is a factor. Every time I've been doing a mushroom journey, I have been having apprehension. This is
Mm.
not a mild undertaking to go deep inside, and I never know what's going to reveal itself. I might go into some very unpleasant memory or a situation in the world that I will connect with that will take me on my knees and bring me to a sense of anguish or agony. So it's not guaranteed that it's going to be a great expansion to the world of spirit. And there is that factor of the apprehension towards the unknown. And then there is the possibility of a challenging journey. And I don't know if you want to get into this now or not, but the journeys are showing us, revealing from within us the material that we are able to handle. It might be impressive, it might be challenging, it might be suffering, it might be somewhat scary to agree to look at it or feel it or have the emotional texture really take over our entire being. But it is an experience that we are capable of handling. I've never seen a journey that was not appropriate to the purpose of our evolution and the seriousness of our intention and the solidity of the setting. So it is important to accept, even though we don't like it, to accept what we are seeing or feeling during a journey.
I'm impressed by how small a difference in set can seem to have enormous implications for the character of a trip.
Hmm.
I remember I once, I mean, this is really not science. This is purely anecdotal, but my personal experience is such that I've taken the same compound in the presence of the same guide, a very experienced one as it turned out. I mean, this was my first LSD trip was in the company of Ram Dass, originally Richard Alpert, who did the work at Harvard with Timothy Leary. for which they were both fired. And I had a subsequent experience with him. One was, among the best acid trips I ever had, and one was among the worst. And the difference, again, I am just guessing. I can only say what I was consciously aware of as the proximate cause of my anguish in the second case. But it really seemed to me that I had had an experience the day before with a friend that I was bothered by, and it gave me cause to worry about kind of the path of life I was walking at that point, and it just my identity. And then I took acid, and I began thinking about that as I was taking off and achieving something like escape velocity. The trajectory of my trip would seem to be kind of defined by this personal glitch from the day before, and I never quite recovered. It just became I was pitched into some form of self-reflection and chaos that had a very negative character. I'm wondering how common that is, and I mean, it's hard to imagine that even now, if were contemplating a trip now and I had something like that happen the day before, it didn't seem like a big deal, right? Until it got horrifically magnified by this LSD trip. I'm wondering how you think about the kinds of things that people are thinking about prior to a trip and whether it ever makes sense to reschedule this in light of, the seemingly superficial things that are going on in one's life.
Well, I hear you and I resonate with what you say and what you recall in the difference of these LSD experiences for you. And I've had similar situations myself, as well as seeing that in people I've worked with. It's always very serendipitous to me that a situation would present itself prior to a journey like you had, which would then take you into an experience of suffering, possibly, or questioning and just seeing the effect of a disturbance in your psyche, in your physical system, in your emotion, or what that may remind you of, or the face of that disturbance. I think those are very important factors. And I believe they're actually very, useful. I'm not saying they're pleasant again, but, I don't believe in maximizing the positiveness of an experience by trying to have, a perfect day before an experience because,
Mm.
life happens. And I think that these experiences show up before an experience for a certain reason, for a certain purpose, right? Mysterious purpose to illustrate an aspect of what life is, what human suffering feels like. And I think this is fruitful for expanding our capacity to embrace many different experiences of human nature, including disturbance and aggravation and questioning and suffering, right? Irritation, anger, all these are part of what we ought to be able to hold in compassion. And so I hear you, and at the same time, I believe that things happen for a reason. I mean, if there is like a car accident or some major drama in the family immediately before an experience, I would definitely recommend to wait. But something that just brings up some irritation or some unpleasantness might be actually fruitful.
Okay, well, so we'll talk more about good and bad in a moment, but let's say a few things about dosage.
Okay.
How do you view the decision to do higher versus lower doses of any of these compounds?
The usage of a lower dose might be more an easier way to enter such experiences for people who've never done anything like this. It might be more user friendly to have a little bit of mushrooms in a context of contemplation and personal relationship with the guide or in nature. So lower doses are more positive and inviting into the space of this other state of consciousness, non-ordinary state of consciousness, or expanded state of consciousness. So lower doses are good entry points. And then, as the dosage rises, the magnitude of the experience, of course, expands. And, like we said, requires different environment or different intention or different depth of context and set.
Mm. And lower doses, we would distinguish those from what's called microdosing now, which
Yes.
has become quite popular
Mhm.
for at least LSD. I guess people are also microdosing mushrooms, and are they microdosing MDMA as well?
No,
I've heard rumors of that, but is that
no, it's
happening?
not. It's actually not a very good idea at all. MDMA
No.
is not made to be microdosed. It actually raises anxiety. It's not a good idea.
Right. Okay. So a microdose is really, virtually subliminal. I mean, it's not changing much. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it a microdose. And for something like LSD, you're talking about 5 micrograms, whereas a psychedelic dose of LSD starts around, 100 or so. Is 100 micrograms of LSD still considered a standard psychedelic dose?
Yeah, it's the beginning of a of a psychedelic experience. Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So I guess we should give a few more dosages here because LSD really is an outlier in how potent it is. It's the one measured in micrograms. Virtually everything else is measured in milligrams for the drug compound. With dried mushrooms, you're talking about grams. Can you equate the potency of a psychedelic dose across, let's say, LSD and mushrooms? I mean, what is the equivalent of a 100 microgram LSD dose in mushrooms, would you say?
3 grams. I
And
mean, this is really average because everybody's very, very different in sensitivity, of course, but we're talking ballpark here. Huh?
right.
Hmm.
But also we're talking about, in the case of mushrooms, a natural product, right? So there's
Hmm.
variation in the potency of mushrooms, isn't there?
Somewhat, yeah. Somewhat, yeah. That's true. Yeah. It varies depending on the batch, depending on the time of year, the season, if they're fresh, if they are cultivated. There's many different variables. Yeah.
And also for something like ayahuasca, you're talking about natural products that have been brewed up, and I would imagine there's some significant variation in the potency of what the ayahuasca guide has concocted in that case. Ayahuasca is not something I've ever taken, so I don't have any firsthand experience here.
Yes, it is. It is very. Ayahuasca is a very, yeah, a brew, a compound that can vary a great deal depending on the concentration, depending on the additional herbs that are added sometimes to the brew of the vine and the leaf. It depends. Yeah, the concentration varies greatly. I've had a period of my life where I was very involved with the ayahuasca as a participant, and there were some brews that were very thick, and then some brews that were very thin, some brews that were more fermented than others, and the experiences were very radically different, actually.
Mm.
So the ayahuasca is even more. It is more variable with ayahuasca because it's a man-made compound. Yeah. Hmm.
Is there any principle here where one runs a greater risk of having a destabilizing experience that is a quote bad trip at a lower dose than would be psychedelically optimal? This is something I know nothing about, but from my own
Hmm.
experience.
Hmm.
But I've had some experiences where it has seemed like the strength of a high dose has just catapulted me beyond, any possibility of being entangled with the details of my personal psychology. Whereas at a lower dose, it can give a consideration of one's personal issues, a nuclear powered imperative, right? So it's if you're going to be pitched into your own neurosis, you suddenly have a ton of energy for that. Whereas given a little bit more energy, you might have escaped that strata of mind altogether. Is that a principle you've experienced in yourself or others, or do you think that the risk of having a bad trip just goes up in some linear way with dosage?
It varies. I hear you, Sam. There is the okay. In a big dose, in a higher dose, one goes through the process, right? It's like a fast birth, right? It goes through, you can't escape it. It has you, it transforms you, it chews you up and spits you out on the other side. And There's no resistance, and it can be, I don't want to say it bypasses your psychology, but it definitely goes through that canal much
Mm,
faster. Now, a bad trip is a trip where you are actually kind of stuck in the birth canal, so to speak, where there's no resolution. You are just in the matrix of this, Stan Grof call it, the birth matrix, right? Where you are in the birth canal and you are not actually birthing yourself into the great light. You are actually still in your contraction and compression of your suffering or of your wounding or your trauma, and you have to go through that. And so that's what they call bad trips. They meaning people who don't have a context or an understanding or a guidance to really understand why that journey was actually highly transformative and healing. In the lower dose, or what I call the medium dose, one can get a little bit stuck in bardo, I call it, where you are not really, you are understanding the making of your suffering or the condition or the circumstances of your predicament, and yet you don't have the resolution. You don't go on the other side. You don't liberate yourself from it. And you are just circling and cycling and looping over this topic indefinitely, and that can be really challenging. And I personally find these medium doses more challenging than a higher dose
mm.
because I'm aware that I'm stuck in this loop. Whereas in the higher dose, I'm in the loop, but at least there's a place in me that is not tracking that I'm afraid. I'm just sheer suffering, and and hopefully on the other side there is someone to welcome me and help me restore my balance and my resourcing and my understanding of this journey. So the medium doses can be really challenging. Some people like the idea of or the experience of being able to be in their process and have enough of their ego self to witness the process they are having, which is valid, which is valid. But sometimes this process of being in one's difficult place can be stuck and not very easy to liberate oneself from.
Well, we've begun talking about it already, but let's dive into a discussion about good and bad trips. And again, this is an experience that could be idiosyncratic to me, but I feel like I've met people for whom this resonates, and I wonder what your general take is on this. In my experience with LSD, I took it maybe, I would say 10 to 15 times in my 20s, and I took it, once and had just, there was not even a scintilla of negativity or fear or the possibility of having a bad trip. I had heard that, people have bad trips, and I just could not, for the life of me, see, what direction you would have to be pointed in order to find anything bad about this experience. And I would say that that was true for the next 7 or so trips. And then on one of these trips, just the door to hell swung open, and I had a truly, harrowing encounter with. Ultimately, it was probably, shame on one of these trips and terror on another. But each subsequent trip of mine, the possibility of having, some ordeal was always there. Whether the trip was, good on balance, there was some element to it, and I thought of this as, the door to hell having been left permanently ajar. Is that a common career path through psychedelics, or was that just sort of the luck of the draw in my case?
It's normal and actually good. I hate to say that to you, but having a harrowing experience of shame or any other very challenging and unpleasant human emotions is actually a very empowering journey. To be able to accept, live through, survive, suffer through such experience is really what makes someone more whole. People come to me and say, "Oh, I want to experience, I want to open up." And I said, once you open up to everything. You don't open up just to the beauty and to the spirit and to the great love, although that is essentially what we are and what is out there. But you're also open to everything that is in you, including very challenging and suffering experiences because you are a human being. And a human being is made of a whole spectrum of colors that include suffering, that include excruciating moments of the human experience that you ought to be able to cradle with the compassion that you owe to yourself in order to be able to have compassion with other beings that are going through a
Hmm.
suffering experience. So I tell people, this journey into psychedelics is a journey of compassion. It's a journey of being able to suffer with, which is what compassion is, suffer with yourself, suffer with others, and know that every human experience is what you ought to be able to endure, open up to, revel into, and suffer through, and survive through, and love all of it. So yeah, once you open the door to shame, guilt, anger, greed, all these things, you're actually better for it. You're actually better for it. You're more whole than if you have just pleasant experiences. You're more
Hmm.
complex, you're more mature, you're more adult, you're more prepared for life, really.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you there up to a point. I mean, so you have this wonderful line in your book. It's not about being happy; it's about being whole. And I certainly agree with that. I mean, certainly there are trivial notions of happiness that can be made much more profound by integrating, more of the human experience. And compassion is obviously a necessary feature of living an examined life. And my bad trip certainly increased my compassion, both for myself and for others. And it gave me insight into just how much a human mind can suffer, right? And so I can't imagine having any sense of what a mentally ill person is going through, but for the fact that I've had certain experiences on psychedelics. But I do think that, and this is why I essentially stopped taking psychedelics for 25 years, it felt like a kind of emotional, psychological, spiritual spin of the roulette wheel to take any of these compounds. And I do feel that when I came away from so-called good trips, I mean, the trips whose
Mhm.
character was basically pleasant, and, pleasant in this category means, stupendously so. I mean, being completely surrendered into the most positive emotions, one has ever felt and, never even knew existed. Coming away from that experience, having, essentially a million years worth of gratitude or love, it just kind of reamed through your mind. That improved me neurologically. I was better for having had that experience, even if I couldn't remember all the details. But conversely, some of my bad trips felt like they actually harmed me neurologically, in the sense that I was just thereafter, for some months, I was more neurotic and more encumbered by self, and less resilient. And again, this is not science. This is just, my personal journey. But in the end, I felt like, there's no telling what kinds of experiences I'm going to have here. And this, I'm now really into meditation, and that's a far more predictable tool of insight. I'm not being pitched, to heaven and hell by turns. And so I just came away feeling like not all bad trips are useful in the end. And I mean, certainly we know that, anyone who's going to be pitched into a proper psychosis is not someone about whom we can say, well, that bad trip was exactly what they needed. So, what's the limit case of you being sanguine about the utility of unpleasant experiences on psychedelics?
I found that, I hear you. First of all, I want to say I hear your narrative, and I want to say that I'm really hearing that it was really a challenging turn for you and a challenging place to live with, and a very unpleasant turn of event as it was. But I also want to say that I have seen people in my practice having such experiences, and I want to suggest, of course, I'm not here to redo your past, but I want to suggest that if you had some guide who had been able to skillfully reflect back the possible value and the possible empowerment of that
Mm.
experience, you may have considered that experience differently through the process of this empowerment, of this maturing, of this capacity to open up to a place of suffering and maybe looking at how your life was afterwards. So I'm proposing that as a suggestion. I'm not saying it would have made a difference, but necessarily, and I'm not 100% sure of that. But part of these challenging trips like this really ought to be treated with the utmost care and detailed integration, because there are, unless, as you say, they really draw someone into psychosis and destabilization. And I totally agree with you that these are not useful, challenging trips. But if a trip shows something of the human suffering or a part of our human condition, such as shame, or, I think those have to be really, really handled with the utmost care and reflection and value for what they possibly empower us with.
Mm.
So we go into, again, the role of the guide and the role of the integration and the aftermath, how a journey like that is handled. It's always easy to handle the great journey. Wow, I had a great journey.
Yeah.
But even those great journeys ought to be integrated carefully, because a great journey can also be just a great experience that stays on the shelf. And so it ought to be integrated similarly than a difficult journey. But when a journey is challenging, it really deserves to be skillfully debriefed or decoded or understood in the context of the person's evolution, or the thresholds that someone goes over in their maturing process. So I often saw difficult journeys being pulled, not pulled, but brought through a lens of intelligence like this, of seeing their purpose in the context of someone's life, and the person being completely a 180, considering that journey as the one that was most transformative, really. So I've seen that. Of course, it varies from person to person, but I've seen a lot of those journeys being really the ones that were you know, most meaningful.
Yeah, yeah, and I actually don't doubt that
Mm.
had I been in dialogue with someone who could have reframed the experience, that might have had an effect. So let's take the good side of the equation here for a moment. What are the principal insights and, so-called good experiences that people have on these various compounds? Again, we'll talk about specific compounds in a moment, but what would you generally say is the center of the bullseye as far as why one takes these drugs in the first place?
Mhm. Well, I feel like people come out with a sense of love. I know it's a word, right? It's like Michael Pollan in his book said, well, the essential thing is love. It's a platitude,
Mm,
but it really goes back to, we are here because of love. We are here to love each other. We are here because we want to love ourselves. So we give ourselves this experience of psychedelics to go deeper into the fabric of who we are, to know ourselves deeper, to experience our life more fully, to create more fully, to express ourselves more fully. And so there is this passion, this what people go into psychedelics with, a sense of passion for themselves, passion for the human experience, the capacity of that experience, and the expression of that experience in life, in their work, in their family, and in their experience of the degree and the degree of their connection with spirituality and the
mhm.
divine, and a belonging to a greater force, light, power of creation, God, however. So that's really what people are drawn to psychedelic for. Now, on the way there, there's a lot of psychological work that gets unraveled. There's a lot of light brought into very difficult traumas, histories, biographies, cultural, religious background. Some countries were torn by war, and or veterans working with their trauma. I mean, there's a lot of material that is being unraveled, of course, in the midst of that purpose of creating greater connection and harmony with oneself.
Yeah, there's also at certain dosages and in certain settings, the connection to nature can really be transformative. It's very easy to, I would imagine, never have had an experience of nature anything like what one gets on 100 micrograms of LSD or an appropriate dose of mushrooms. I mean, just the beauty of the natural world becomes so intense and overwhelming emotionally that I think it can motivate a kind of environmental and global consciousness, that has, ramifications for just how one thinks about the world and technology and the progress of civilization and all the rest. And we see the political echoes of, millions of psychedelic experiences in, all of those movements that, that take as their chief object of concern the sustainability of the natural world. I remember I was, this is one of my early acid trips when acid trips were only pleasant.
Hmm.
A few friends and I had the brilliant idea that we would camp out near Muir Woods, which is one of the tallest stands of old growth redwoods in the world in Northern California. And we would get up at dawn and drop acid and then walk down into the woods, and we would be coming on to acid just as, we found ourselves in the grove of, some of the tallest trees on earth. But we mistimed things and got, I don't know, we were probably still a mile from Muir Woods when we came into the presence of a tree, which in hindsight was as ordinary a tree as you could hope to find on planet Earth. I mean, this was probably like a 20-foot tall tree. And yet we had the beatific vision in the presence of this tree and basically never got past it. I mean, we were with that tree for 8 hours, I would say. So it really doesn't matter what tree it is. In the appropriate state of mind, that your connection to the living world of nature
Hmm.
can be completely overwhelming. And it's not to say that one would
Hmm.
want to inhabit this state of consciousness at all times, because you couldn't drive a car or do much of anything else in it. But to have never tasted it is to be blind to that possibility.
Yes, I mean the resonance with the organism of nature is such a deep, archaic, fundamental hunger in all of us, and I think
Mm,
that we really want that in the most profound cellular memory of who we are. We are coming from nature. We are nature. We are. And those mushrooms, for example, I mean, that could be LSD too, but in the case of mushrooms, they are immediately grown from the earth. So they are a messenger of earth wisdom or these other psychedelic compounds that are of nature, grown by nature on the planet. So we are immediately in connection with the earth intelligence and her immense wisdom for growing those compounds. I mean, the magic of making something like that to for human beings to be able to ingest and understand her, really understand her multifaceted beauty. So yeah,
mm,
it's a very very wonderful. I mean, wonderful, but like ecstatic and all-encompassing experience to be in the presence of nature. I remember a long time ago, I was with a friend of mine, and I mean, long, long time ago, and we were thinking of maybe doing a workshop together, and we took a little acid just to kind of, think about what we were going to create, and we lay down on the field and just stared at the clouds passing in the sky for the next 5 6 hours. It was really light. It was like a 50 microgram or something, and we just watched the clouds, and we just commented on the clouds, and we never thought about anything else. Just being with the beauty of the sky was all that mattered at the moment, and we felt more inspired afterwards than we could even have imagined. So I understand, the purpose of going somewhere and then being stopped in your track by something else. So.
Let's talk about the stages of
Mhm.
a trip. If you, I don't know if you've demarcated them for yourself. There's a place in your book where you do it a bit, but how do you think of the staging of a trip? And I guess I want to bring you back to this principle of resistance or its lack, and whatever advice you have around it, because it seems to me that the difference between a good and a bad trip, or the thing that characterizes the most difficult parts of the most difficult trips, is a kind of resistance to the experience that becomes or can become catastrophic, where you're trying to hold on, the you being the ego, this fictional part of you that thinks it's in control of things, is trying to seize the reins in a circumstance where it has become totally impossible to have the illusion of control, and just the energetics of your mind have completely changed. You simply just can't fly the plane anymore, and yet you are not disposed to surrender to that. And so this is, connecting back to the part of the conversation where we spoke about one advantage of having an overwhelming dose of any of these compounds is that the illusion of control is hammered right out of you, and you're pitched into whatever the experience will be. How do you think of resistance and surrender in relation to the stages of a trip?
So generally, the trip, now we're talking about a fairly high dose of mushrooms or LSD. Yeah? So the beginning of the trip generally is the apparition of colors and shapes, or a certain sense of energy circulating in the physical system, or maybe a sense of fear or apprehensiveness that flares up that can bring people to tears a lot of time. A sense of not panic, but like, oh my God, I'm going to be rolled over. And so that is generally the beginning of the journey. Then there is a phase of what we call the deconstruction, when the ego is in fact being, invited to remove itself or surrender, or being set aside. So sometimes it's hammered, sometimes it fades, sometimes it surrenders. It kind of depends of the level of many things. It depends on the set. It depends on the guide present. It depends on the experience of the journeyer. It depends on the skillfulness of the guide that holds the space. Because in those states, we have to take in consideration that the expertise of the guides really impacts the depth and the capacity of the journeyers to surrender. In those states, the subliminal consciousness of the journeyers is connected with the skill and expertise of the guide. It's an invisible field that is very, very present, and it's hard to describe it, but the journeyer goes as deep as the guide has been, as far as the guide has been, or as deep as the guide has gone. So that echo is very significant in the capacity of the journeyer to surrender. The resistance topic is an interesting one. Resistance is, again, the degree of the ego to let go. Some people at some point, and again, some people can have surrendered greatly and then all of a sudden have a resistance show up because something in the psyche is about to get revealed, and there is great resistance to that material. And resistance can show up anytime, at any moments, for any journeyer. So it's not a linear arc, so to speak. And some people have had resistance and then one day have none because of different conditions and variables. The resistance is illustrating the amount of fear one has inside. So fear to the unknown, fear of dying, fear of going mad, fear of what is unseen and mysterious, fear of some emotions, fear of loving, fear of disappearing and melting into the ether. So the resistance is generally proportionate to fear. It's an illustration of fear. It can be accompanied by a skilled guide who can then, help someone breathe, hold someone's hand, put their hand on someone's head, sing a certain song or play a certain music. There is different ways to accompany this process of resistance and possibly even facilitate the alleviation of resistance and the melting into the journey. So the surrender of the ego structure is a phase in the journey, and it's not an easy phase for everyone. Some people really go into this layer of difficulty in melting this ego structure layer, and it can be accompanied and facilitated and somewhat uh, soothed or reassured. The human contacts and the presence of the guide and the faith that a guide brings into their own into the journey from their own experience. Again, like
Mm.
the personal mileage of the guide really impacts the capacity of the journeyer to let go with that support. So there are different interventions to apply in those moments that can be really fruitful.
Mm.
But I have had a journey. I remember it's one of my most epic journey right at the beginning when I was doing this work. I had had a few very wonderful journeys, remembering my birth and being alive and different things. And then I had this one journey where I was completely resistant for the whole time. The whole journey I was resistant, and my guide was coming to me and said, "Just breathe, breathe." And I was just resistant. I wouldn't let go. And basically for the entire journey, I did not let go, and I had a fairly high dose of mushrooms. And and I spent the entire journey waiting it out, waiting it out, waiting it out. And at the end, I came out of the journey and I was peaceful. There was no more anger in me. There was no more resistance. I had exhausted my amount of resistance possible in my physical human body, and I was totally peaceful. And for days and weeks later, I was totally at peace. Nothing would upset me. Nothing would irritate me. I was in a full acceptance. I was really surrendering to life after having been in my utmost resistance. So
Mm.
I remember that too being part of that's how a journey works. It can exhaust the resistance to its limit.
It really seems that almost any variant is possible here. You can have
Absolutely.
it's a little it is amazing to consider that basically everything is on the menu.
I agree. I agree. And, uh, there's no two journeys alike. There's no two moments of life alike, right? I mean, life happens, and every day is a new situation and a new set, really. And so we are constantly in movement, and so it's very hard to predict any journey, any content, any outcome. What I find myself really leaning on and relying on over time is the making sense out of whatever happened. Whatever happened has a purpose. I don't have to be clear immediately about why did that happen in myself or why did that happen in my client. But my purpose as a journeyer and as a guide is to really make sense of whatever I was able to touch in the journey. Because I want to believe that my psyche has a wisdom. I'm not just
Mm.
I'm not just there to hurt myself. This is not opening myself in the context of a safe, guided journey and a respectful use of medicine and self respect is really going to be a tool on my healing path, on my growth and consciousness healing path. So I want to believe that everything that I'm doing in that direction is helpful. And I'm going to try to find out why and how.
Okay, so let's talk about specific compounds, and I guess we should start with magic mushrooms, which are your real zone of expertise. The
Yes.
the active ingredient there is psilocybin, which breaks down to psilocin, which I believe is the true active ingredient. And there are about, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's something like 200 species of mushrooms that contain these compounds, both psilocybin and psilocin. And mushrooms have been used for centuries in many countries, especially in Mesoamerica and in places like Mexico. And the Spanish left 16th century records of the Aztecs using mushrooms in their rituals, and they tried to stop that practice. And now there's a lot of work going on with the synthesized molecule psilocybin in particular, done by people like Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins, and it's showing immense potential as it has for many years for depression, end of life anxiety, PTSD. Psilocybin, along with MDMA, is where most of the energy is going in terms of the therapeutic use of psychedelics at this point in research. And it's not an accident because the percentage of people who take, even one dose of psilocybin in a controlled therapeutic environment, who come away feeling that it was in the top 5 most important experiences of their lives is extraordinarily high. It's above 70%. So it's just amazing that there's a compound out there, that naturally occurs in a mushroom or in, hundreds of different types of mushrooms that can open the door to that kind of profundity for people. again, under the right circumstances, with the right set and setting, in the company of an appropriate guide, etc. How do you think about mushrooms or and psilocybin uniquely as a psychedelic? What is especially the case? And we've been speaking in general terms about the capacity of these drugs to dissolve boundaries and open the mind to a range of emotions. Is there anything that seems unique to mushrooms or especially available through this door?
Yes, I have a great respect for that medicine, obviously, for that compound, for that organism, I should say. Its value and its presence in the natural world is something we have to look at, because what mushrooms accomplish in the natural world, they accomplish in our body and in our psyche and in our journey. So when mushrooms have a function of composting and surrounding an organism, decaying organism, with their mycelial body, and basically chewing it, right? Liquefying, transforming the feeding on the glucose of the organism, and composting it and recycling it and reclaiming it for the life of the forest floor, the life of the river, or all this natural environments. This is the function that the mushrooms have inside our organism. So when we ingest mushroom, they have this role and this function of composting our toxicity, our contaminated self from belief system and background and wounding, into life affirming energy and vitality. So for me, the mushrooms is one of the main medicine to eradicate and reclaim the life cycle as it is doing in the world, in the natural world. The other thing, it filters, right? The mushrooms are known to filter water, filter air, filter soil, and they filter our internal system. And the filtering creates a new capacity for our unwounded self, we call the original soul self, to bring its through its circulation, to bring its ease and peace and harmony into our physical and emotional system. The other thing that mushroom is really unique for in the world out there is the mycelial body, as we all know, with some different writings and different research by Paul Stamets, or in the movie Fantastic Fungi, it's really well illustrated. There is a capacity of connecting a tree to a rock, to a river, to another tree. And the mycelial network is really a matrix, a web of communication between different organisms in the natural world. And when we ingest mushroom, we are basically the natural world of those mushrooms, and we are the land on which they create this communication network. And so emotions can be connecting with physical ailments, and physical ailments can be connecting with a spiritual dimension that connects with a memory of a spiritual moment in life, that then connects with, you know, our life as a family currently. So all this network of communication is really happening within us when we ingest mushrooms. And I think it's important to see the way an organism exists in the land is the way the organism will exist in our land, in our body. I'm big on that, because when I look at other organisms like ayahuasca or like peyote, we can see that each organism growing on this planet and being containing psychedelic compound is really teaching a very specific aspect of wisdom from the natural world.
I hear you making a poetic analogy between how the mushroom functions as an organism in the world and the phenomenology of the conscious states induced by ingesting it. But is it really just an analogy? I mean, do you actually think
Yes.
that you can justify it with respect to the difference between the experience one would have, on mushrooms versus LSD? Because, and I guess let's bring LSD in here as a comparison compound. I mean, LSD is also derived from a or was originally derived from a fungus, the ergot fungus that's parasitic on rye and wheat and barley, I think, and maybe other grains. And then it was synthesized by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, I think in 1938. So it comes to us in synthetic form in every case, but it has a precursor
Mhm.
in the natural world. Can you generalize about the difference between the experience on psilocybin versus the experience on LSD at comparable effective doses?
Yes, I think they're pretty comparable. I want to step back for a moment and just say that the brain imaging that has been happening at the Imperial College of London by Robin Carhart Harris is
Mhm.
really showing actually what does happen as far as multiplication of connection within the brain during a psilocybin journey. So
Yeah.
we can see that in fact there is evidence such experience maximizes the network connection within our physical brain. So yes, it is a poetic, a distance to go into the way the mushroom are connecting different aspects of ourselves. But it's it is just the empirical finding or reports that I've heard from people over the my years of work that have led me to conclude this narrative that I was just saying. So I just wanted to add that to your commentary, which
Yeah.
was, of course.
But I mean, I guess the point I would make there is that LSD and presumably mescaline and probably other psychedelics that which we don't have much research on could have a very similar profile there, neurofunctionally. I guess I'm wondering just what, if anything, seems to characterize the experience on mushrooms that would differentiate it from LSD or any of these other drugs. Taken, let's say, in darkness or behind a blindfold, are magic mushrooms more visual than LSD at
No, I
at
don't think
similar
so.
doses, or
I don't think so. I think on similar doses, there's as much vision with LSD that there is on mushrooms.
Mm,
Mushrooms traditionally are taken in darkness, especially on high doses, because the reality is external objective reality, quote unquote, is too transformed and too distorted. And so it's more productive to be turned inward. And traditionally, those journeys are inward turn journeys. LSD, similarly, I mean, some people can take LSD and lie in the darkness with some music for 8, 9 hours and have a very similar experience. I do think that LSD in general is taken more on in concerts or with friends, or it's more of an explorative medicine. So it's tend to be used more, not recreationally, but more interactively. Huh?
mhm.
But a high dose of LSD that would be similar to a high dose of mushroom is more productive when it's turned inward, I believe.
What about the capacity to provoke an experience of other entities or other sources of intelligence? I mean, this is something that in my last mushroom trip, I was sort of hoping to have and sort of did. And it was because it was something I had heard spoken about a lot, especially by Terence McKenna, and I had never taken mushrooms at a high dose, and I had much more experience with LSD and had never had this feeling of encountering something that was to which I was in my mind was in relation at, anywhere near the peak of an experience. Is it as likely to happen with LSD as with mushrooms, or is that more of a mushroom thing?
I think it can happen with LSD. Like you said, very rightfully so. LSD is derived from ergot, which is a
Mhm.
mushroom. So essentially, this is the same original compound. It's one step removed because it's synthesized. And so it's like a little bit less organic in nature than mushroom are, of course. And mushroom tend to be more visceral and more physically calling for, a certain physical experience in a lot of people, not systematically.
Mm.
But yeah, I believe that the connection with other entities or other intelligences are part of the mushroom world. And, I've heard people talk about that in ayahuasca a lot,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
And I've had some of this experience myself in ayahuasca. So, it is, I think that when we are opening these layers and slices of possibility and realities, we are making ourselves available for other realities that are possibly existing out there that we don't perceive in this layer of consciousness. And this is a bit of a mystery. We can only hear the recalling from people who are, there's a certain percentage of participants and journeyers who are starting to gather stories about this entities and other intelligence, those other level of of other existences out there that are mysterious to us human.
Yeah, I should say that I'm totally agnostic as to the ontological status of anything one encounters in experiences like this. And it's totally possible to come up with an account of these experiences that deflates them and makes them, mere impressions of the brain. I mean, we all meet other entities or seem to meet other entities in dreams every night, and yet it's very easy to believe that this is just brain activity convincing you that you're in the presence of others who don't exist. So it could be that, certain psychedelics under certain conditions are supercharging that effect. I don't know, but it's an experience that is different than merely feeling that your own perceptions have been expanded or transformed. I mean, to feel that you're actually now in some kind of dialogue with something other than yourself,
Hmm.
whether it's just energetically or, linguistically or, visually. It's an experience that's there on the landscape of mind to be encountered. Are there any other differences between LSD and psilocybin, i.e., mushrooms, that are interesting here? I mean, it was certainly a difference in duration of effect. How long would you put a mushroom trip
Mm.
at these days?
The mushroom trip is about, I don't know, 4.5, 5 hours.
And
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 in
what would you put the peak of that at? If you took a large dose of mushrooms, what is the full oblivion of the peak measured in hours?
you would probably peak at about an hour and a half, and you would be peaking for about 2 hours,
Mhm.
and then starting slowly to calm down, reintegrate, have a big bit of a better sense of your location and your body and where you are and who you are. The LSD is longer. An LSD trip is about 9 hours with a peak of about 4 hours.
Mhm.
So it's a much longer experience. Yeah. Hmm.
And, well, let's bring some other compounds into this conversation. So, do you have experience with mescaline,
Yes, I do.
both synthetic and peyote, or
Yes, synthetic and peyote, mostly San Pedro, which is the
Mhm.
tall cactus from South America.
And the active ingredient there is also mescaline?
Exactly
Uh,
the same as peyote. Yeah.
this is a drug I've never taken,
Hmm.
and, but it's the drug that in its synthetic form, inspired Aldous Huxley to write The Doors of Perception, which was really, in the literature of psychedelics, a seminal moment. I mean, that was the book that convinced so many people that there was something to explore there. So, how would you compare mescaline to LSD and psilocybin?
I considered mescaline as a non-hallucinatory drug. I mean, I don't like to call mushroom and LSD hallucinatory, but
Mhm.
they are creating visions. They are creating a whole realm of experience internally that is like an intense dream, that where reality can disappear. I find the experiences with San Pedro mescaline containing San Pedro cactus, called also Wachuma in South America, as an experience that is possibly bringing insights and understanding and some vision, but much less so than LSD, ayahuasca, or mushrooms. And the essence of the mescaline is really perception, meaning what do I perceive here now in this moment? What is evident to my understanding life, to what surrounds me? What how do I reflect on my life? And this is a very powerful and beautiful experience. It gives people a lot of physical energy. People can walk for hours on mescaline. People can have their eyes open. The reality does not distort, does not move and distort like on LSD, ayahuasca, or mushrooms. And the experience is extremely long, it's about 12 to 14 hours. It's a kind of a long ordeal. The arc is, long. The high of the experience, it goes in waves, so it's a little less like the arc of a ayahuasca mushroom or LSD does contain some waves, has a little bit of wave, but it's mostly an arc. Whereas in mescaline, there's very definitely ebb and flow in the experience for a
Hmm.
long time until it fades out. It's a very significant experience of validating, understanding, a place of cognitive intelligence that is not intellectual, but it's very like Zen Buddhism. You
Hmm.
see what you see and you reflect it back, and it's what it is. There's not a lot of emotionality to it, unlike mushrooms or LSD, which can contain a lot of emotional flavors. Mescaline is more, even though there can be a great amount of gratitude, towards the end is more, the emotional body is more open. But during the thick of the experience, it's really a sense of extreme clarity, which is why
Hmm.
Huxley wrote what he wrote, because it was an extreme sense of clarity of what life is.
Interesting. Well,
For
okay, I'm going to put
yeah,
that on my to-do list,
yeah,
Francoise.
exactly, exactly.
Okay, so let's bring ayahuasca and
Mhm.
its active ingredient or principal active ingredient, DMT, into the conversation. How would you compare those? And we should say that ayahuasca, the orally active brew, or the brew in which DMT is orally active, is quite different from the very short-acting DMT experience that people have when smoking the pure compound. A compound, incidentally, which is an endogenous neurotransmitter that is doing something that we have yet to fully understand. How do you think of the ayahuasca DMT experience here?
Well, I am not an expert in ayahuasca, so I want to preface that with, respectfully naming that I'm not an expert.
Mm.
So I don't want to, step over the expertise of some other people here. So I want to just, do this disclaimer.
Out of curiosity, how many times have you done it?
Probably 25 times. So I have some
Okay, well, you're
experience over a
you're
period of few years. I was, involved in that. So I have some experience. I'm not ignorant about it, but again, to draw a conclusion is very, very, I have a very thin layer of experience to be able to really, declare something. You know, Ayahuasca is known to get us in touch with the very core DNA matrix of our being, the snake shape DNA helix that we are,
mm,
that connects with the divine, that is also of of a snake shape, that connects with our guts, that is also a snake shape, that connects with the Amazonian reptilian force, that is very much based on survival and instinct and rawness of our being, that also transcends the rawness into a space of surrender. Ayahuasca being known for its purgative effect, and really bringing people literally in a intense purge, not systematically and not always, but when I've done ayahuasca, there was a lot of
mm,
that going on. And
mm.
the effect of purging, really having your intestine out of your body, literally, is the vomiting and the diarrhea is really clearing literally the entire inside of your body in a purification process that leaves you extremely connected with spirit, with the essential self that we are. It's a very potent experience. It can also be intense physically due to the purgative effect, and some people are, challenged with that. Some people love the purification process, so it's very individual.
Well, as much as I love vomiting and diarrhea, I think I'll be taking mescaline over here.
It is definitely an ordeal.
Yeah.
Ayahuasca can be an ordeal. I've seen also I've known some friends of mine who have brewed this brew and said that it was extremely beautiful and not at all purgative. So I may have to try their brew
Mm.
someday. But yeah,
So, and have you smoked DMT?
no,
So DMT as distinguished from 5-MeO DMT, which
correct.
was famously first found in the venom of a toad. How anyone began smoking the venom of a toad is anybody's guess, but now we have synthesized 5-MeO DMT, which is another short-acting drug. Do you have experience with that, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken?
yes. I have a lot of experiences with that, quite a bit. And it is a fabulous experience of disintegration, of great expansion of consciousness, of depending on the dosage. This is a very interesting material that can be used in different magnitudes and can be guided and can be led intelligently. Some people have guided me into this work, this exploration with 5-MeO DMT in a very, very skilled manner and fruitful. I've gotten in touch with very essential place of my family lineage and history, and got a great sense of expansion of consciousness and archetypal embodiment of ideas and themes that were brought down to my human understanding. Very powerful experiences. If it's well guided, it can be extremely beautiful and enhancing intelligence. Yeah.
And also very short, isn't it? Like less
45
than half
minutes.
an hour?
45 minutes.
Okay.
The smoking of the DMT is about 10 to 15 minutes, 20 minutes at most. The insufflating of 5-MeO DMT can take a person into a journey for about a good 45 minutes. Mhm.
So, Salvia divinorum, what is that experience like?
Well, Salvia divinorum is a fascinating herb. It is part of the trilogy of the Mazatec medicines, one being the mushroom, the other one being the Salvia divinorum, the third one being the morning glory seeds, which
Mm.
are very, very similar to LSD. They are also called ololukui in the traditional language. And these three herbs, or these three organisms, are really the holy trinity of the Mexican Mazatec people. And the Salvia
Actually, so I think we should issue a caveat here. Don't go to your local
no,
plant supply store because morning glory seeds, if I'm not mistaken, are routinely treated with some toxin so that you
yes.
can't take them as a drug. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely. And if
okay.
anybody goes to websites such as a vault like Arrowweed or anything having to inform regarding the usage of morning glory seeds, it will be signaled that is very, very dangerous to take anything that has been treated. And so, and again, this is a sacred medicine, a sacred organism from a tradition, and it ought to be used with utmost respect and information, you know. But the Salvia venerum is a very interesting compound that only recently has been really studied in science by this man named Daniel Siebert, who is still among us and a very great lover of this plant. And he has been able to isolate the salvinorin chemical. The plant is used traditionally in the raw leaves that are being chewed and kept in the mouth. It's absorbed by the sublingual membrane, so it's not something that should be swallowed and absorbed by the stomach. It's absorbed by the sublingual membrane, and so the journey is about an hour. Someone can ingest or chew, few leaves up to 20 something leaves. Depending on the quantity of leaves, the journey will be more potent or less potent. And the space of the journey is a very interesting experience of a two-dimensional reality that brings the journeyer into a state of understanding object consciousness. What it's like to be green on a wall, what it's like to be the space between two letters in a word. And this frontier of consciousness in a human level is extremely fascinating for me. It doesn't add to my psychology or it doesn't add to my spiritual understanding of the great force of life, but it certainly helps me in my capacity to surrender to what I don't understand and don't conceive of. So I really like Salvia divinorum. It's a very powerful substance. My dear friend Ralph Metzner and I were in great exploration of Salvia divinorum, and I was collaborating with him in exploring the ways we could actually guide people into understanding the divinatory aspect of Salvia divinorum, meaning how can one understand the invisible reality that surrounds an experience, meaning what exists that we don't perceive around a specific experience of our lives. And Ralph and I had designed this guided process for taking people into exploring traumatic events or very unpleasant events of their life, and looking at, during the experience, we would actually talk to them and looking at the healing presence of an entity, a person, a situation, or element of nature was present during this unpleasant experience. And we experimented with various clients of mine and friends of mine, and the findings were remarkable. And we were really starting to develop a protocol, which I'm intending to continue, because it's a very powerful way of exploring wounding and healing capacity that exists at the time of the wounding. It's a very interesting plant, very
Mm.
interesting, and the Mazatec hold it at very sacred.
So I want to bring in two more compounds here. That's ketamine and MDMA, both of which you have a lot of experience with.
Mhm.
These are different in many respects. I mean, they're not classic psychedelics or hallucinogens. MDMA is often described as an empathogen or an entactogen and operates more at the level of emotion than perception or cognition. And ketamine is technically an anesthetic and a dissociative. Which do you want to take first?
Well, I'll tackle MDMA,
Okay.
if I may say. Well, MDMA, as we all well know, is diligently studied, and a protocol is very diligently created by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, in order to treat PTSD. And the reason why MDMA is so effective, and in my experience has been so effective in my own addressing my own trauma, actually years ago, and my own assisting my teacher with the usage of MDMA, is because its capacity to reduce the experience of trauma, of intensity and fright and overwhelm during the journey. So one can narrate and remember and talk about and feel what is needed to be experienced without being overwhelmed and flooded with intense fright. So it's a very powerful compound to reduce and treat PTSD. It's also on a more, I would say, casual usage. It's also a wonderful medicine to create more healthy and more individuated relationship. It's been known in the times when MDMA was used for therapy, when it was legal, and I was talking with Anne Shulgin about it a couple of years ago, how pertinent and powerful it was for couples to do MDMA together, because the people could talk about their own experience to their partner without projecting and blaming and putting on the other the reason of their misery. And they were more able to really own their process and share their process in a more vulnerable manner, and reciprocally listening to their partner process in the same way, which created a greater deal of intimacy and resolution of tension and drama in relationship and
Mm.
marital issues.
Yeah, this is the one drug where taking it with a significant other, or at least having the energy of the experience explicitly directed toward one's relationships, makes a lot of sense. I mean, it really is
Yes,
it targets this
yes,
experience of unconditional love and acceptance without any, if memory serves, without any psychedelic transformation of one's perception. So that the experience is of being, even on some level, more sober than normal, but just seeing things through the lens of this, unconditional love toward both the people in one's life and even toward, all sentient beings, if one is in the frame of mind to think of them. So it's just in terms of feeling compassion and acceptance and just feeling as emotionally healthy as one never even imagined was possible. That's been my experience on it. I mean, again, it's been more than 25 years since I've taken it, but it was the first drug I took that convinced me that it was possible to live. It had to be possible to live a much better life than I was tending to live.
Yes, I also see, and I know that Rick Doblin, the head of the director, president of MAPS, will also echo this. MDMA is also called ecstasy in the street, and it's not always ecstatic. We've had, I mean, the principle of narrating one's combat experience or a terrorist attack or rape or
Mm,
being battered or violated as a child is not necessarily bringing a great sense of love for everyone. I mean, this
yeah.
is so depending on the material that is being treated and addressed in the moment, it can bring also very challenging experiences of feeling the fear of the young child or the stress of the veteran and the combat or bombs falling around, or it can really be a challenging moment. But again, it's not recapitulating trauma, so it's not a re-traumatizing experience, even though it deals with the trauma. But the experience can be really challenging, and I myself have had moments on my healing trajectory with MDMA that was those moments were really difficult, even though they were ultimately extremely healing. So
Mm. We should also say that dosage here is something that you do want to get right. I mean, this is,
mhm.
I think the toxicity data on MDMA or, the jury is still out there. It's always felt, again, this is only something I've taken maybe something around 10 times in my life, but it always felt harder coming down from this drug than other psychedelics. And as far as I know, the effective dose and the what's called the LD50, the dose at which 50% of people in this case would die, those are not as far apart as they are for other compounds of which we've been speaking. So, the
Mhm.
lethal dose of mushrooms is so far from the effective dose that, you'd have to eat some extraordinary amount of them, probably your own body weight in mushrooms to kill yourself based on the toxicity of the material. That's not to say that if you have some other, peripheral process like high blood pressure, you might not kill yourself some other way. But the fear with something like mushrooms is not around the physical toxicity of the drug, and even much less so for LSD because it's so potent. You're taking micrograms of it, and you would never take anything close to something that could kill you. Whereas MDMA, I believe a dose that should worry you is, physically is not much more than 10 times the prescribed effective dose. This is a drug you could conceivably overdose on in a way that you can't on acid or psilocybin.
Yes, I agree. And, let's remember that MDMA, the A of MDMA is amphetamine. So
Mm,
the effect of speed or tension or, even though there's a great effect of openness and in some people, like you described, a great sense of compassion and love, there's also sort of an amphetamine vibration in the compound itself that leaves traces of tiredness and exhaustion and tension in the jaw and in the body. So it is taxing. It is a bit more challenging to recover from an MDMA journey, even on a regular dose. It takes a little more to rest afterwards, whereas a
mm.
mushroom or LSD or even ayahuasca would be a lot more an easier compound to return from. Yeah.
What is the dose you recommend of MDMA?
Again, it varies depending on the person's sensibility and experience in the past, but I recommend about body weight minus 10, 20% up to body weight plus 20%. That's a fairly high dose. I know that MAPS uses about 125 milligram. And if I weigh, let's say 120, my dosage might be less than the MAPS protocol, right? If I was taking 125, that would be a little more than my body weight, which would be a lot for me. And so, but some people who are 180 or 200 pounds still take 125 in the MAPS protocol. And they boost after a while to take another 80, I believe. But in what I've been taught, my teacher used to give people their body weight. So if someone was 180 pounds, he would have 180, he would have 220 or something,
Mm,
which is a lot more, but it's adapted to the size of the person and like that. Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so finally, ketamine, another drug I've never gone near.
Hmm.
Tell me what you know about it.
I know some about it. There was one person that really knows everything about it, and her name is Raquel Bennett. Dr. Bennett is a clinical psychologist in Berkeley, the Bay Area, and she's reputable and very knowledgeable, and organizes international conferences for ketamine. So I recommend going onto her
Mhm.
interface website if one wants more information.
We should say there's a fair amount of work being done now
Yes,
in its use for
that's
treatment-resistant
right.
depression, I
That's right.
believe.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And in those conferences, and I just presented in the conference recently in November, as a matter of fact, the only ketamine conference existing in the world, really, that she organizes. And so it's really, really fascinating, the findings of this compound that is an anesthetic, yes, and used in different dosage and different administration, can offer great legal access to a possible alleviation of depression and of PTSD. There is a wonderful doctor who in Boulder now, he used to be in Austin, Dr. Bonnet, who used to do, he was a medic on the Afghanistan. He was deployed there for many years. And upon returning, he developed this protocol with ketamine, which was legal, to treat PTSD. And he had great findings. And I was really impressed with that application. But it's also, of course, very studied and approved and designated as a great medication-resistant depression treatment.
Mm.
And the results are good. The issue is the necessity of repeating treatment on an ongoing basis. And we're not sure yet of the long-term after effect of such repetitive treatments. We know that there is a little bit of an issue on the bladder. It can create a high sensitivity bladder over time. So there's, you know, it's still unclear what the longer term effect would be for someone who would need ketamine on an ongoing
Mm.
basis.
There's another caveat here, which is ketamine, unlike anything else we're talking about here, I guess with the possible exception of MDMA, is potentially addictive,
Yes.
right? I mean, you don't want to be taking too much ketamine, whereas people do not get addicted to LSD or mushrooms.
That's correct, and
Yeah.
that's a big issue, especially now with the commercialization of nasal ketamine spray, the S-ketamine. That really creates a slight numbing, which possibly can bring solace and a sense of treatment to people with depression, except you have to repeat it on an ongoing basis.
Mm.
So it's a little bit problematic. Now, I've known people who had few antidepressant treatment with ketamine who did very well and did not need repeating. And, it was just either infusion or a intramuscular injection, a series of treatment, and that provided the treatment, the alleviation of depression. And they really didn't need any repetition for, you know, 2 months or 6 months, or some people even didn't need anything after. But most people need a repetition of treatment. And so that's a little bit like I said, the tricky part of ketamine. Now, in my days of using ketamine, and still with some medical person present, of course, using ketamine, the benefit of ketamine is that on a psychedelic dose, intramuscular injection, it can provide an experience of great dissolution of the human self, just like we talked about with LSD or high dose mushrooms, but on a very much higher magnitude. It's a little bit like DMT smoking. It's a disappearing level of our ego, of our body, of course, it's an anesthetic, and of the capacity to perceive the world from our senses. So it really brings everything back and inward towards the implosion of our human experience into a seed moment of the soul, which can be extremely beautiful and spiritually life transforming. And part of my narrative, and a narrative that is being discussed now in the world of ketamine, is the benefit of this spiritual experience as an ingredient for treating depression. Because opening people to a vaster dimension of what the world is or what the human experience can be is
Mm.
a great support system for someone who is very depressed. So the psychedelic experience in and of itself provides an aspect of what depression treatment is about.
Yeah. On some level, it is just kind of a reboot of the hard drive to be taken down to 0 or something like 0. It's just a reference point or a kind of resetting of things. It's easy to see how it would help in depression and other clinical conditions. Is there anything else around the phenomenology of these different compounds you
Mm,
would wanna say in terms of their differences or in terms
yeah.
of, ones that seem more useful or less interesting or
Well, they're all very interesting. Some of them are more aiming at connecting us with ourselves, like MDMA or mescaline. Some others aim to open the field to a vaster dimension of our human experience, like mushroom and ayahuasca, by bridging the personal into a transpersonal, into a vaster dimension, while being in the human and physical and emotional self. And then there is the more like the transcending compounds like 5-MeO-DMT, like salvia on a high dose, like ketamine, that are really dissolving the entirely the concept of self, and yeah, and that's a different magnitude of experience in and of itself.
Okay, so finally, let's talk about integration.
Oh, yeah.
And, if you have any we've now spoken about all these different compounds. I don't know if you have advice that is specific to any one of them, or if you have a general framework under which you think about how to integrate any of these experiences. But what do you have to say about what to do after one comes down?
I believe that integration applies across the board for any psychedelic experience, whatever the compound is. I believe that the experience that we are accessing or being brought into or touching is appropriate to our lives, appropriate to what we can afford to see. And we owe to ourselves and to these revelations or this touching of spirit or whatever it may be. This experience deserves to be brought into our life. It deserves to be woven into the tapestry of our everyday life. So instead of being an experience that, sure, is an amazing moment and it's a aha and it's an understanding or it's touching a vast dimension, those experiences do tend to fade, even though they remain in our memory. They tend to fade and they don't necessarily transform our being and transform the action we choose to do. So, part of this psychedelic work is not just a work of discovery and touching and exploring, but it's also a work of empowerment, of enabling ourselves to live our life in a way that we want to, that we harness our willpower and we harness these journeys in order to live our life in a more loving way, in a more creative way, and so in a more connected way with ourselves and others. So for me, integration is constitutes the different steps. The first step being the narrative of what has been happening in a journey in connection with the set and the intention. Secondly, the making sense of the journey, if sometimes the content might be a little bit obscure, abstract, or needing some decoding. And thirdly, to find ways in which this insight, understanding, compassion, a spiritual dimension will be anchored into life. And I call that designing integration practices. It's very nitty gritty, it's very practical, and it's very empowering the person to take charge of what has happened in the journey. So it may mean that someone who had a great revelation of compassion towards their mother for how much the mother really meant well and was really limited because of her own wounding, and in a journey really opened the compassion and the understanding of her own predicament and her own set and culture and environment. you know, that that insight can be expressed through a connection, a letter, a ritual, a dialogue, and really can be bridged. Instead of being just a feeling inside, it actually is expressed and it is actualized, it is embodied, it is, well, I call it physicalized, it is brought into form. So whatever is in the journey shapes itself into an expression. And it
Mm,
can be a letter, it can be a ritual, it can be if one finds oneself really inhabited with a great sense of vitality after being quite stagnant or lethargic or depressed, one should go ahead and do some yoga or do some walking on the beach and being in the elements. It's not just about knowing something, it's about doing it. There's an old Zen proverb that says, to know and not to do is not really yet to know. So we know only by our doing, by bringing it into our reality, into our body, into our expression, into our experience in this reality. So the experience of awakening vitality or forgiving is not just reserved for the space of the journey, but it becomes part of our life and part of what we are carrying, right? And what part we are not modeling like we are an example, but part of what we are modeling, part of what we are, well, acting for others to see, to witness, or
mm.
to be aware that this journey was actually a transformation, not just a good experience.
We just have to remember the point of this whole exercise, which is to improve one's life across every dimension that one can see that possibility. And so this isn't peculiar to psychedelics. This relates to meditation and one's ethical considerations, one's study of philosophy. It's just anything that is part of how one orients to the project of living an examined life. The point is, on some basic level, to live a better life and to have better relationships and to not suffer unnecessarily and to actualize one's insights. The wisdom has to be lived, otherwise it's just, new beliefs and new concepts that one has taken on. So that's great advice, Francoise. I guess
Hmm.
my final question is, taking us back to the precipice side of this conversation, the potential dangers, the pitfalls, the cautionary tales. We all know people who seem to have taken too many drugs, right? And some of them have actually been rather celebrated pioneers in this space. I mean, we were talking about ketamine a moment ago, and I was briefly thinking about the legacy of John Lilly. I didn't know him. He was a little bit before my time, but, rumor has it he seemed to have taken too much ketamine. What's your sense of how often one should take any psychedelics? And again, I'm not thinking so much about the physical consequences of taking these drugs, because I'm convinced, at least when we're talking about LSD and psilocybin, we're talking about something that is physiologically benign, but still people can fail to integrate these experiences in ways that seem wise, and they can just proliferate these experiences in ways that seem to bring something like disorder to their lives, at least viewed from the outside. What are your thoughts about frequency and how one integrates a psychedelic component to self-exploration into one's life in a long-term way?
Well, I do believe that, of course, as usual, this is the overall answer. It depends, right? There are
Mm,
some people who are still working years later on a journey that was so transformative for them and so rich and so full and so explanatory and so expanding that they don't feel the sense of the urgency of the calling to do another one. And you have some other people who are sort of a feeling the need of revisiting the space of expansion, revisiting the space of remembering their spirit or remembering their connection with others or unity of life. And for some people, it's also a spiritual practice. There are churches out there, as we know, the Native
mm,
American church, the Santo Daime church, the UDV church, and in Mexico, there's not the church, but the spiritual practice of the tradition of the mushrooms. And people practice mushroom on an ongoing basis just because it keeps people remembering what's important, how to live life, how to be embodied, how to be loving, how to, unload the package of stress and unnecessary negative emotions and beliefs and thoughts. So different people, handle their journey space in different ways. I would, there is a saying in the community I'm part of here, that a season is a good rhythm, right? A journey
Mm.
a season, it's a way to remember, it's a way to mark, it's a ritual that repeats itself, right? Just like we have rituals in different spiritual traditions, or people go on retreats once a year or twice a year, or it's a retreat, in other words, right? A journey is a retreat. So how often do we want to retreat? And how do we make, like you said, this retreat material, or these findings, or this new or awakened self, or understanding self? How do we make that self in present in our life? How do we integrate this message, this rebooting? How do we manifest our new self, our renewed self, in a way that our life becomes the transformation? So some people can work for years on an experience. Some people need reminders. But in my counsel to people, I say, well, did you finish to integrate the last journey? If the last journey is has felt honored, has felt your own opening has felt acknowledged and honored and acted and really expressed, then you have a new baseline. Then you're on a new level of your functioning, of your understanding, of your capacity to embrace life or love. And then you can go on to maybe another level or another facets of yourself that deserves exploration. But it all depends on the attention given to the integration. I would
Mm.
not recommend a journey unless someone has worked on some integration of the previous
Mm.
journey.
Well, Francoise, it's really been a pleasure and an honor to get your voice in this track on psychedelics. It's really it's great to have someone of your experience and wisdom